Hello again and welcome to Max Kelly's Vegan Cooking Show. Today on the show, we're going to be making one of my favorite sandwiches and all-around favorite things to eat, a vegan banh mi with homemade bread and mushroom pâté. Alright, so to get things started, we're going to be making some Vietnamese-style baguettes for our banh mis. You, of course, can use store-bought baguettes or French bread and you'll still wind up with a perfectly delicious sandwich. So if you're not planning on making the bread, just skip ahead. I'll be putting some timestamps in the description so that you can go to the sections of the video that you want to see. Let's start with our ingredients. We have 500 grams, or about 4 1/4 cups of bread flour. You can also use all-purpose flour and you won't see much of a difference in final texture of the bread. Just be aware that all-purpose flour doesn't tend to absorb quite as much water, so you might want to take a tablespoon or two out of your water. For yeast, we have 1½ teaspoons of instant yeast. You can use the same amount of active dry yeast, or if you only have fresh yeast on hand, you can bump that up to about a tablespoon. For sugar, we have 1 tablespoon of sugar. This just feeds the yeast, helps promote activity, and helps it rise a little bit faster. We have 2 teaspoons of kosher salt. If you only have fine salt on hand, that's fine. Just use 1 or 1½ teaspoons instead. We have a tablespoon of a neutral tasting oil. This happens to be light olive oil, but you can use canola, sunflower, anything else. You can also use a vegan butter or coconut oil if you prefer. And we have 330 grams, or about 1 2/3 cups of water. So to get things started, we're going to put our flour in the bowl of our stand mixer, and then we're going to add the yeast, salt, and sugar kind of on opposite sides of the bowl. Then mix all those dry ingredients together. I like to use the dough hook since we're going to get it dirty later anyway. And then we're going to start adding our water. So you want to add it maybe about 1/4 cup at a time and use that dough hook to stir it in and incorporate as you go. Toward the end, when you're almost out of water, pour in the oil. You don't want to add the oil right away because it can coat the grains and interfere with gluten development. So mix that in, add the last little bit of water, stir it all together, and then cover it. I like to use a shower cap because it's reusable, but you can use a damp cloth or a piece of plastic wrap. Just let it rest for about 10 minutes. This time allows the flour to fully hydrate and makes the mixing period a little bit easier. Now that it's had some time to rest, put it in a stand mixer fitted with the dough hook attachment and turn the speed up to medium-low. If you don't have a stand mixer, you can use a food processor and just mix the ingredients together for about a minute, or you can knead this dough by hand. Because there's a relatively large amount of water, it's a pretty easy dough to work with by hand, so if you'd like to get into hand kneading, this is a great place to start. Just let it mix in the stand mixer for about 10 minutes or until the dough comes together and starts to pull away from the sides of the bowl. Then turn the mixer off, remove the dough, and knead it on the counter just for a minute or two to make sure that you have the right texture. It should be a pretty soft dough that you can punch into pretty easily, but it should still have a good amount of elasticity and spring back readily when you press down on it. We're going to place this in a proofing container or in a bowl covered with a damp cloth and let it rise for about an hour. A great place to let it rise is in your oven with the door closed and the light on, just to get a little bit of residual heat to help promote the rise. Once your dough has doubled in volume, you're going to want to remove it from the proofing container and return it to the counter. Divide it into 6 equal portions. If you're using a scale, each portion will weigh about 143 grams, and then pre-shape. Working with one piece of dough at a time, pull and press the edges into the center, then flip upside down and drag on the countertop to form into a nice smooth ball. The friction between the dough and the countertop will pull some tension into the ball and help eliminate the seam. Once you've finished pre-shaping your dough balls, cover them with a damp cloth and let them rest for about 10 or 15 minutes. In the meantime, you're going to want to prepare a kitchen towel for your baguettes to rise in. Just take a large, clean kitchen towel and dust it generously with flour. In this case, I'm using rice flour for a couple of reasons. Number one, it doesn't stick as much to the cloth itself, making it much easier to clean later. And number two, it doesn't stick to the baguettes as much, making them much easier to release once they're finished rising. Now that our dough has had some time to rest, it's time to shape our baguettes. So working with one ball of dough at a time and keeping the rest covered, we're going to first pull the four corners of the dough ball into the center, and then working from the top down, gently coil the dough together, almost like a jelly roll. Once we've formed a small log, we're going to place our log seam side down on the counter and roll it into a log about 8 inches long. Make sure to roll your log evenly and press firmly at the ends to give them a nice tapered appearance. Once you're finished, place the shaped baguette seam side up on your floured kitchen towel and tuck the towel around either side to help keep its shape. Repeat with the remaining dough balls and arrange on the kitchen towel like so. Cover your baguettes with a damp kitchen towel and allow them to proof at room temperature for about 45 minutes or an hour. In the meantime, preheat your oven to 450 degrees, and if you have a baking steel or baking stone, place it on the center rack. To check and make sure that they've finished proofing, just cover your finger lightly with a little bit of flour and poke the surface of a baguette gently. It should spring back partially but slowly and leave a small indentation. If it springs back too quickly, it's not quite finished proofing, and if it doesn't spring back at all, then it's overproofed. Transfer the shaped baguettes gently but quickly to an inverted baking sheet topped with parchment paper. We're going to want to arrange these in a kind of staggered fashion so that they don't expand into each other, but you don't have to leave a huge gap in between. We're going to take a lame or a clean razor blade or even a sharp knife and make a deep slash in the surface of each baguette, running from tip to tip. Once that's done, open your oven and use the parchment paper to slide them in. If you don't have a baking stone or a baking steel, you can just bake these directly on the baking sheet. Bake them for about 10 minutes and then remove the parchment paper gently and distribute your baguettes evenly on the baking sheet, baking steel, or baking stone. Bake for a further 10 minutes and then remove from the oven and allow to cool for about a half hour to an hour on a wire rack. Next up, we're going to be making our mushroom pâté. Like the homemade baguettes, this is technically optional and you can make a perfectly delicious banh mi without it, so if you're not feeling up to making a pâté, skip ahead to the later parts of the video. We're going to be using about 6 large criminy mushrooms. You can also use white or button mushrooms, or maybe about 1 to 1.5 portobello mushrooms. We're going to use a red onion, or if you prefer, you can use a couple of shallots, and we're going to use 1 large clove of garlic. In addition to that, we're going to have a half a cup of walnuts, 1 tablespoon of miso paste. I happen to use red miso, but just use whatever you have on hand, and a half a cup of rinsed French lentils. You can also use green lentils or brown lentils. Start by giving your onion a nice fine dice, then press and mince the garlic, and cut those mushrooms in half and then slice them thinly. In the meantime, bring a small pot of water to a boil, add a pinch or 2 of salt, and then stir in your French lentils. Cook those for about 25 minutes or until they're tender, then drain them in a colander and put them off to the side. While your lentils are boiling, toast your walnuts in a dry skillet for about 5 minutes or until they just start to turn brown and become aromatic. Remove your toasted walnuts from the pan, set them aside, and return the pan to the heat. Set the heat to medium and add your mushrooms to the dry pan with a couple of pinches of salt. Stir the mushrooms around and the salt will help the mushrooms release their liquid. This should take about 5 minutes. Once the liquid is mostly evaporated and the mushrooms start sticking to the pan, add about 2 tablespoons of vegan butter and then stir for another 5 minutes or so until the mushrooms start to brown. Then you can add your minced onion, stir until it softens and becomes translucent, then add the garlic and 1 more tablespoon of vegan butter. Once you start to see some brown bits sticking to the bottom of your skillet, pour in a couple tablespoons of cooking wine, stock, or even just plain water to deglaze. Then stir in your miso paste, lower the heat, and stir everything together to combine. Shut off the heat and let your mixture cool for a couple of minutes, and then add your lentils, walnuts, and mushroom mixture to a food processor. Process for a couple of minutes or until it comes together in a nice smooth paste, then remove from the processor and put in a dish. It might not be winning any beauty contests, but I promise you it'll add a delicious depth of flavor to your finished banh mi's. Cover your finished pâté with plastic wrap or a lid and let it chill in the fridge while you prepare the other ingredients. Next, we're going to be preparing some tofu to serve as the main protein in our banh mi. If you have a real aversion to tofu, feel free to substitute a different protein of your choice, but if you give this method a chance, I promise you'll be happy with the results. Start by mixing up 2 tablespoons of cornstarch, 1 tablespoon of soy sauce, 2 tablespoons of cooking wine like Shaoxing wine, mirin, or dry sherry, and 2 tablespoons of a neutral oil. Stir those all together to mix, and then let's move on to the tofu. You want to use firm or extra firm tofu, and in this case I'm using a block of extra firm tofu that I've pre-frozen and thawed, because I find that freezing makes it easier to remove the water and results in a chewier, denser texture. Either way, remove as much of the water as you can from your block of tofu, and then slice it along the wider edge into about 12 evenly sized slabs. Dip the slabs into your cornstarch mixture and turn to make sure that they're nice and evenly coated, and then arrange the slabs on a wire rack set on top of a rimmed baking sheet. The tofu does sometimes stick a bit to the wire rack, so either coat it with some cooking spray, or if you prefer, you can just set the tofu directly on a baking sheet or on a baking sheet lined with parchment paper. Just make sure to flip it upside down about halfway through the baking time. If your oven has a convection setting, preheat it to about 450 degrees convection or 475 degrees on a normal setting, and then bake the tofu for about 25 minutes. After 25 minutes has passed, remove your tofu from the oven and brush either side with a mixture of 1 tablespoon each hoisin sauce and oil. Then return to the oven and bake for 10 minutes more. Remove from the oven and allow to cool on the wire rack. Next, we're going to be making a garlic and sriracha infused butter. Obviously, mayo is a more traditional condiment, and feel free to use a vegan mayo as your base if you'd rather, but I happen to prefer the flavor and texture of butter instead. So all you're going to do is take 3 tablespoons of butter, microwave it for about 30 seconds until it's melted, and then add 1 clove of finely minced garlic and about 5 teaspoons of sriracha. Stir it together, then cover it lightly with plastic wrap and place in your fridge to thicken up and set. And last but not least, we're going to prep some veggies to top our banh mi. We have here 2 small cucumbers, but you can use any kind of cucumber that you have on hand, 1 jalapeno pepper, 1 piece of purple daikon radish. This is just what they happen to have at the store, but white daikon is perfectly fine. You can also just use regular old radishes if that's all you have available, and 1 very large carrot. We're just going to give our cucumbers a nice quick slice, then set those slices off to the side and do the same with our jalapeno pepper. Then we're going to make our pickled daikon and carrot mixture. Cut the daikon into thin slabs, and then slice the slabs lengthwise to make thin matchsticks. Repeat this process with the carrot, cutting the carrot into about 3 chunks first so that you wind up with matchsticks of a more manageable length. Add your daikon and carrot to a medium-sized mixing bowl and toss with a couple of pinches of salt. The salt will help extract some of the natural water in both the daikon and the carrot. Finally, add about 2 tablespoons of rice vinegar and 1 tablespoon of agave, sugar, or any sweetener of your choice. Toss to combine and set aside. And finally, the moment we've all been waiting for, it's time to assemble our banh mi. Slice open one of your baguettes lengthwise and slather the bottom slice with some of your sriracha butter. Then spread a generous amount of pâté on your top slice. Now add 2 slabs of your baked tofu, some of the veggies that we just prepared, and finally finish it off with a generous amount of cilantro and fresh Thai basil if you happen to have it available. And there you have it, a delicious homemade vegan banh mi. Enjoy. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like, consider subscribing to the channel, and let me know in the comments section if you have any questions or you'd like to see any other specific recipes in the future.